The locomotive's whistle pierced the September morning, like a prayer answered too late. Steam billowed across the wooden platform of Millbrook Station as passengers stepped down into the golden light, their faces bright with anticipation of reunions and new beginnings. But Catherine Wells remained frozen in her seat by the window, her gloved fingers clutching a letter that had promised her salvation and delivered her into something far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Through the glass, she could see him waiting, tall, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and a beard that was more grey than brown. James Sullivan looked exactly as he had described himself in his careful penmanship. What he had failed to mention, however, were the 5 figures standing behind him like a small army of uncertainty. Children, 5 of them, ranging from a defiant-looking girl who appeared nearly grown to a toddler who clung to the older girls' worn skirts. Catherine's heart hammered against her corset as the full reality crashed over her. The matrimonial agency had promised her a fresh start, a chance to build a life with a prosperous merchant who sought companionship in his golden years. The letters had spoken of quiet evenings by the fire, shared meals, and the simple contentment of 2 souls finding each other after life's disappointments. Not once had James Sullivan mentioned that he came with a ready-made family larger than most households could accommodate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The conductor's voice calling, "All aboard for the return to Philadelphia," snapped Catherine from her paralysis. She could still leave. Her ticket was valid for the return journey, and her small inheritance would last long enough to find other employment, other possibilities. But as she watched the tall man shift nervously from foot to foot while scanning the emptying train cars, something in his obvious anxiety touched her practical heart. Catherine Wells had been born practical. At 26, she had already buried. Both parents closed their modest dressmaking shop after the larger factories drove away their customers and spent 2 years working in conditions that would have broken a less determined woman. When the textile mill closed and left half of Philadelphia's seamstresses without employment, Catherine had faced a choice that thousands of women like her confronted every day: find a husband or face a future of increasingly desperate circumstances. The matrimonial advertisements in the newspaper had seemed like providence when she first read them. Respectable widower seeks companionship, must be of good character and domestic inclination, comfortable home and security guaranteed. The exchange of letters that followed had revealed James Sullivan to be educated, thoughtful, and refreshingly honest about his circumstances, or so she had believed. He wrote of his mercantile business, his substantial home, and his deep loneliness. Since his wife's passing 3 years prior, he had seemed like an answer to prayer. Now, stepping down from the train with her worn carpet bag and matching valise, Catherine wondered if she had been naive to trust in the careful phrases of a stranger's correspondence. The September air carried the scent of wood smoke and ripening apples, and the small crowd on the platform moved with the unhurried pace of people who knew each other's names and stories. It was exactly the kind of place she had imagined building a quiet life. But the presence of 5 children changed everything. James Sullivan approached with hesitant steps, his hat in his hands and uncertainty written across his weathered features. He was taller than she had expected, with the kind of solid presence that spoke of hard work and steady character. Behind him, the children maintained their protective formation, and Catherine could feel their collective gaze assessing every detail of her appearance. "Miss Wells," James said, his voice carrying the same careful courtesy that had characterized his letters. "I cannot express how grateful I am that you've made this journey. I hope the train was comfortable and that you're not too weary from the travel." Catherine set down her bags and straightened her shoulders. Years of managing difficult customers and impossible deadlines had taught her to face awkward situations with dignity. Mr. Sullivan, the journey was quite pleasant, thank you, though I must say your letters failed to mention some rather significant details about your household. A flush crept up James's neck, and the oldest girl behind him, a young woman, really, with dark hair braided severely back and eyes that held too much knowledge for her apparent age, stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to taking charge. "He means us," the girl said, her voice carrying a note of challenge that suggested she had been through this scene before. "I'm Sarah Sullivan, and these are my brothers and sisters. Daniel is 13, Mary is 10, Peter just turned 6, and this little one is Emma. She's 2 years old come October." The girl's directness caught Catherine off guard. There was something almost protective in the way Sarah positioned herself slightly in front of the younger children, and her eyes held a wariness that spoke of previous disappointments. Catherine found herself studying each face in turn. Daniel, serious and watchful, already showing signs of the man he would become. Mary, gentle-featured with curious eyes. Peter, small for his age, with a stubborn set to his jaw. And baby Emma, round-cheeked and clutching a worn cloth doll. "These are your children," Catherine said, stating the obvious as her mind worked to adjust her expectations once again. "They are," James confirmed, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame or exhaustion. "Their mother, my beloved Margaret, passed during Emma's birth. I should have explained in my letters, but I feared." He trailed off, glancing at the children who were listening to every word. Sarah's chin lifted with unmistakable pride, mixed with defiance. "He feared you'd refuse to come, just like the others did, Mrs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thompson from town lasted exactly 3 days before declaring us unmanageable. Miss Ellen from the church made it through 1 week before deciding we were too much trouble for any decent woman to take on. The pain in the girl's voice was carefully hidden beneath her matter-of-fact tone, but Catherine heard it nonetheless. These children had been rejected before, dismissed as burdens rather than blessings. The realization stirred something fierce and unexpected in Catherine's chest, a protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. "I see," Catherine said quietly, her gaze moving from James's anxious face to each child in turn. "And what do you think of your father's arrangement to bring me here?" The question seemed to surprise both James and Sarah. Peter scowled and muttered something about not needing another mother, while Mary shifted closer to Sarah's protective presence. Daniel studied Catherine with the careful assessment of someone forced to mature beyond his years. Only Emma seemed unconcerned, reaching one small hand toward the bright buttons on Catherine's traveling dress. "We think," Sarah said after a moment's consideration, "that Papa deserves to be happy, but we also think that anyone who comes here should understand what they're truly agreeing to. We're not looking for someone to replace our mother. We're looking for someone who can accept us as we are." The honesty of the statement took Catherine's breath away. This 15-year-old girl had been managing not only her own grief, but the emotional well-being of 4 younger siblings. The weight of such responsibility should never rest on such young shoulders, yet Sarah carried it with a dignity that spoke of both necessity and deep love. "That seems perfectly reasonable," Catherine replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Perhaps we might continue this conversation somewhere more private. The platform seems an unusual place to conduct such important family business." Relief flickered across James's features. "Of course, forgive me. The wagon is just there, and our home is only a short ride through town. I hope you'll find it comfortable, though I must warn you that 5 children do create a certain level of delectivity. Might The wagon ride through Millbrook revealed a prosperous community nestled in a valley between gentle hills covered in maples and oaks, just beginning to show their autumn colors. The main street boasted a general store, a church with a proper bell tower, a blacksmith shop, and several other businesses that suggested a thriving local economy. People waved to James from their doorways and porches, and Catherine noticed how their curious gazes lingered on her unfamiliar face. The Sullivan house sat on a tree-lined street at the edge of town, a substantial two-story frame building with a wraparound porch and well-maintained gardens. It was larger than Catherine had expected, with enough space for a growing family and the kind of established permanence that spoke of generations calling it home. But as they approached, she could see signs of a household stretched beyond its management. Laundry hanging haphazardly on lines, toys scattered across the front yard, and gardens that had once been carefully tended now showing signs of neglect. Margaret was the gardener, James said quietly, following Catherine's gaze to the overgrown flower beds. I've tried to maintain what I can, but between the business and the children... It's a beautiful home, Catherine said truthfully, and gardens can be restored with patience and care. Inside, the house told the story of a family struggling to maintain order without a woman's organizing touch. The furniture was good quality and well chosen, but dust gathered in corners, and children's belongings seemed to migrate from room to room without any controlling hand. The kitchen showed signs of recent meal preparation, but also the kind of accumulated disorder that came from too many responsibilities and too few hours in the day. Sarah immediately busied herself putting on the kettle for tea, moving through the kitchen with the efficient motions of someone who had been managing a household far longer than her years should have required. Daniel disappeared to complete some outdoor chore, while Mary settled at the kitchen table with a slate and chalk, working on what appeared to be arithmetic problems. Peter regarded Catherine with suspicious eyes from his perch on a chair near the stove, and Emma toddled around the room, chattering to herself in the mysterious language of two-year-olds. I realize this is not what you expected, James said as he hung his hat on a peg by the back door. If you prefer to return to Philadelphia on tomorrow's train, I would certainly understand. I should have been more forthright in my letters about the children and our circumstances. Catherine removed her gloves and bonnet, considering her options with the same practical assessment she had applied to every major decision in her life. She could indeed return to Philadelphia, but to what? Her savings would last perhaps 3 months, and employment for women of her age and circumstances grew more scarce each season. More than that, something in Sarah's fierce protectiveness of her siblings and James's obvious desperation to provide stability for his family touched the part of Catherine that had always been drawn to challenges others considered impossible. "Where might I find an apron?" she asked, pushing up her sleeves with decisive motions. "If I'm to stay for more than one evening, I suspect there's quite a bit of work to be accomplished." The transformation in the room was immediate. Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her watchful expression remained. James's relief was so profound that Catherine worried he might actually weep. Even Peter looked up from his suspicious surveillance with something that might have been cautious interest. "You mean to stay?" Mary asked in a small voice, her chalk suspended above her slate. "For now," Catherine replied carefully. "Your father and I have an arrangement to explore, and that cannot be done properly in a single afternoon. Besides, it appears this household could benefit from an extra pair of hands." What followed was Catherine's introduction to the complex dynamics of a family held together by necessity, love, and the sheer determination of a 15-year-old girl who had been forced to become a mother to her siblings while still being a child herself. Sarah had organized their lives with impressive efficiency, but the strain was evident in the tight lines around her eyes, and the way she constantly checked and rechecked every task. Daniel had assumed responsibilities that should have belonged to a grown man, managing many of the outdoor chores and serving as a buffer between his father's business obligations and the household's immediate needs. Mary proved to be the family's peacemaker, gentle and observant, quick to soothe tensions between her siblings. Peter tested every boundary with the determined enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who had learned that sometimes defiance was the only way to maintain any sense of control. And Emma, blessedly unaware of the family's precarious emotional balance, moved through her days with the joyful confidence of a child who knew herself to be loved. The first week tested every domestic skill Catherine had acquired during her years of managing her parents' household and shop. Sarah watched her every movement with eyes that missed nothing, clearly expecting either failure or the kind of criticism that would justify her protective suspicions. The girl had developed her own methods for managing everything from Emma's meals to the weekly laundry, and she guarded these systems with the fierce protection of someone who had learned that chaos was always just one disruption away. Catherine approached each task with the same careful observation she had once applied to learning new stitching techniques or managing difficult customers. She watched how Sarah prepared Emma's food, noting which textures the toddler preferred and which caused fusses. She observed the family's morning routines, identifying the pressure points where tardiness or confusion typically developed. Most importantly, she listened to the conversations between siblings, learning the unspoken rules and relationships that governed their interactions. Daniel proved to be more willing to accept help than his older sister, perhaps because his responsibilities lay primarily outside the house, where Catherine's presence felt less threatening to established routines. He showed her where tools were kept, explained which animals required what care, and gradually began sharing some of the burden that had been weighing on his young shoulders. His relief at having adult support was palpable, though he tried to hide it behind the stoic facade he had developed. Mary responded to kindness with a hunger that broke Catherine's heart. The 10-year-old had been starved for feminine attention and guidance, and she blossomed under Catherine's gentle interest in her drawings, her questions, and her quiet observations about family dynamics. When Catherine discovered Mary's collection of sketches hidden beneath her mattress, beautiful, detailed drawings of her family, her home, and the world around her, she made sure to provide proper paper and pencils, watching the child's face light up with joy. Peter remained the household's most determined opponent to change. He tested Catherine's patience with pranks that ranged from mildly annoying to genuinely disruptive, as if trying to drive her away before she could decide to leave on her own. His hostility seemed to stem from a deep-seated fear that accepting Catherine would somehow betray his mother's memory, a concern that Catherine understood even as she worked to address it with patience rather than confrontation. Emma, blissfully unaware of the complex negotiations taking place around her, simply absorbed affection wherever she found it. The toddler's easy acceptance of Catherine's presence gradually became a bridge between the new arrival and the older children, who couldn't maintain their suspicions while watching their baby sister reach eagerly for Mama Kate's arms. James observed these developments with a mixture of gratitude and amazement that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. "I haven't seen them this settled since Margaret's passing," he confided to Catherine one evening as they watched the children playing in the yard after supper. "Sarah has been carrying burdens that should never rest on such young shoulders, and Daniel, well, he's been trying to be the man of the house when he should still be allowed to be a boy." Catherine studied the family dynamics with the same analytical approach she had once applied to fitting complicated dress patterns. Each child had developed coping mechanisms for their loss and their changed circumstances, but these adaptations came at costs that were becoming increasingly apparent. Sarah's fierce independence masked a deep exhaustion. Daniel's premature maturity concealed a longing for guidance and support. Mary's gentleness hid a profound need for stability. Peter's defiance protected a wounded heart, and Emma's easy affection spoke to a child who had never known a mother's love. The realization that slowly formed in Catherine's mind was both daunting and strangely liberating. These children didn't need someone to replace their lost mother. Such a thing would be impossible and wrong to attempt. Instead, they needed someone who could appreciate the family they had become while helping them grow into something even stronger. They needed an adult who could support Sarah without undermining her importance, guide Daniel without diminishing his contributions, nurture Mary's gentle spirit, understand Peter's protective anger, and love Emma without reservation. Most surprisingly, Catherine discovered that she needed them as well. Years of focusing on survival and practical necessities had left little room for the softer emotions, but watching these children navigate their daily challenges with such courage and determination awakened something in her that she had thought permanently buried with her parents. She found herself genuinely caring about Mary's arithmetic progress, celebrating Daniel's success with a difficult farm repair, appreciating Sarah's fierce loyalty, understanding Peter's emotional struggles, and delighting in Emma's daily discoveries. The turning point came on her sixth evening in the Sullivan household. Catherine had been mending clothes by the light of a kerosene lamp when she heard the soft sound of crying from the kitchen. Following the sound, she discovered Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the ingredients for the next day's bread, tears streaming down her face as she stared at a bowl of flour. "I can't remember how Mama made it rise properly," Sarah whispered when she noticed Catherine's presence. "It's been turning out heavy and dense for weeks now, and Peter won't eat it, and I can't seem to manage everything she did. No matter how hard I try, I can't be her." The raw pain in the girl's voice cut straight through Catherine's careful emotional defenses. Here was a 15-year-old child trying to fill an impossible role, holding herself to standards that would challenge a grown woman and breaking her heart in the process. Catherine settled beside Sarah at the worn kitchen table, studying the girl's tear-stained face in the lamplight. "You're not supposed to be her," Catherine said gently. "You're supposed to be you, and that's more than enough." "But I promised. Papa, I'd take care of everyone," Sarah said, her voice breaking completely. "I promised I'd keep us all together, and if I can't even make proper bread—" "Sweet girl," Catherine said, reaching out to cover Sarah's work-roughened hands with her own. "You've been taking care of everyone beautifully. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. That's why I'm here." "But you won't stay," Sarah said, echoing the fear that had been haunting all the children. "They never stay. We're too much trouble, too much work. Mrs. Thompson said we were like a pack of wild animals, and Miss Ellen said no woman should be expected to take on such a burden." The anger that flared in Catherine's chest at hearing how other adults had spoken about these precious children surprised her with its intensity. Then they were fools who couldn't recognize treasure when it was placed before them. "You children are not a burden. You're a gift, and I'm not going anywhere." The promise slipped out before Catherine could consider its implications, but once spoken, she knew it was true. Somewhere in the past week, without her conscious awareness, these children had claimed a piece of her heart that she hadn't even known was available. The practical considerations that had brought her to Millbrook, security, companionship, a stable future, had been overshadowed by something far more powerful and unexpected. Sarah looked up with eyes that wanted desperately to believe, but had been disappointed too many times to trust easily. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that," Catherine confirmed, squeezing the girl's hands gently. "Now shall we see about teaching this bread dough some manners?" I happen to know a few tricks your mother might not have shared." Working side by side with Sarah in the quiet kitchen, Catherine discovered that bread making was more than a domestic skill. It was a ritual of connection, a way of nurturing that went far beyond the simple provision of food. As they kneaded the dough together, Sarah's rigid shoulders gradually relaxed, and she began sharing memories of her mother that she had kept locked away for fear of causing additional pain to her father and siblings. Margaret Sullivan had been a woman of quiet strength and infinite patience, according to Sarah's careful recollections. She had possessed the rare gift of making each child feel special, while maintaining the delicate balance required to keep a large household running smoothly. Her loss had created a vacuum that Sarah had tried desperately to fill, but the girl was beginning to understand that some roles couldn't simply be assumed. They had to be grown into with time, support, and the wisdom that came from experience. Catherine found herself sharing her own memories as they worked, speaking of her mother's dressmaking business and the lessons learned about managing difficult situations with grace and determination. She told Sarah about the challenges of running a household on limited resources, the importance of flexibility when plans went awry, and the secret that had sustained her through the most difficult times: the knowledge that love was not a finite resource that could be depleted, but rather something that grew stronger when shared generously. The bread that emerged from the oven the next morning was golden and fragrant, with the perfect texture that had been eluding Sarah for weeks. More importantly, the process of creating it together had established a foundation of trust between Catherine and the girl who had been serving as the family's emotional anchor. When Peter grudgingly admitted that the bread tasted almost as good as Mama's, Sarah's smile lit up the entire kitchen. The success of their bread-making collaboration marked the beginning of a new rhythm in the Sullivan household. Catherine and Sarah developed a partnership that honored the girls' existing knowledge while introducing new approaches and techniques. Together, they reorganized the pantry, established more efficient routines for meal preparation, and created systems that would allow Sarah to focus on her own education and development rather than spending every waking moment managing household emergencies. Daniel proved eager to accept Catherine's assistance with responsibilities that had been weighing heavily on his young shoulders. The 13-year-old had been attempting to manage not only his school obligations, but also many of the farm's maintenance needs and repairs. Catherine's practical background in managing a business proved invaluable as she helped him prioritize tasks, develop more efficient approaches to recurring problems, and create schedules that allowed time for both work and the childhood activities he had been neglecting. The boy's relief at sharing these burdens was profound and sometimes overwhelming. One afternoon, while they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, Daniel suddenly stopped his hammering and looked at Catherine with tears threatening to spill from his determined eyes. "I was scared I was doing everything wrong," he admitted quietly. "Papa tries to help when he can, but the store keeps him so busy, and I didn't want to add to his worries. I kept thinking that if I made a mistake, something terrible might happen to the animals or the crops, and it would be my fault." Catherine set down her own tools and studied the boy's earnest face, recognizing the crushing weight of premature responsibility that had been placed on shoulders far too young to bear. "Daniel, you've been doing an extraordinary job under impossible circumstances, but you're 13 years old, and you should be allowed to make mistakes without the world collapsing around you. That's how we learn and grow." The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which each of the Sullivan children had been struggling with responsibilities and fears that should never have been theirs to carry. Daniel's anxiety about the farm's management, Sarah's terror of failing to keep the family fed and clothed, Mary's worry about being a burden during her frequent quiet spells, Peter's guilt over his inability to remember their mother clearly. and even Emma's occasional fussiness when she sensed the older children's stress. All of these concerns had been festering in the absence of adequate adult guidance and support. Catherine began addressing these issues with the same systematic approach she had once applied to managing her parents' business during difficult economic periods. She established regular times for private conversations with each child, creating opportunities for them to express their concerns and fears without the pressure of maintaining strong facades for their siblings. She worked with James to redistribute household responsibilities more appropriately, ensuring that the children's contributions were valued without being essential to the family's basic functioning. Most importantly, she began the delicate process of helping each child understand that loving and honoring their mother's memory didn't require them to attempt the impossible task of replacing her. Margaret Sullivan had been irreplaceable, but that didn't mean the family couldn't grow and change in ways that honored her legacy while meeting their current needs. Mary responded to Catherine's gentle attention like a flower turning towards sunlight. The 10-year-old had been suppressing her own needs and desires in an effort to avoid adding stress to the household's already strained dynamics. Under Catherine's encouragement, she began sharing her artwork more freely, expressing opinions about family decisions, and gradually developing the confidence to pursue her own interests rather than simply following her older sister's lead. The child's artistic talents proved to be remarkable, extending far beyond the simple sketches Catherine had initially discovered. Mary had been documenting her family's life through detailed drawings that captured not only their physical appearances, but also their emotional states and relationships. Her portfolio included tender portraits of Emma learning to walk, action scenes of Daniel working in the fields, quiet studies of Sarah reading by lamplight, and even sympathetic sketches of Peter in his various moods of defiance and vulnerability. Catherine recognized that Mary's artistic abilities represented more than mere talent. They reflected a level of emotional intelligence and observational skill that could serve the child well throughout her life. She began encouraging Mary to expand her artistic exploration, providing new materials and suggesting techniques that would help develop her natural gifts. More importantly, she helped Mary understand that her gentle, observant nature was a strength rather than a weakness, and that her contributions to the family's emotional well-being were every bit as valuable as her siblings' more obvious achievements. Peter remained the household's most challenging member, testing Catherine's patience and resolve with pranks and behavioral problems that seemed designed to provoke rejection and abandonment. The 6-year-old's hostility appeared to stem from a complex mixture of loyalty to his mother's memory, fear of being hurt again, and frustration with his position as one of the younger children in a family where everyone else seemed to have important roles and responsibilities. Catherine approached Peter's defiance with the same patient persistence she had once applied to dealing with the most difficult customers in her parents' shop. She refused to take his provocations personally, instead trying to understand the pain and fear that motivated his behavior. Gradually, she began to recognize patterns in his outbursts and identify the triggers that typically preceded his most challenging moments. The breakthrough with Peter came during a particularly difficult afternoon, when he had spent the morning systematically disrupting every attempt at normal household activities. He had hidden Mary's drawing pencils, put salt in the sugar bowl, released the chickens from their coop, and culminated his rebellion by tracking mud through the freshly cleaned kitchen while wearing his best Sunday shoes. Rather than responding with anger or punishment, Catherine calmly helped him clean his shoes and asked if he would like to help her prepare a special treat for after dinner. Peter's suspicious acceptance of this invitation led to an afternoon spent making molasses cookies, a process that required careful attention, precise measurements, and the kind of focus that seemed to settle his restless energy. as they worked. Together, Catherine began sharing stories about her own childhood, including tales of the mischief she had occasionally caused and the patient adults who had helped her channel her energy in more positive directions. She spoke of the importance of testing boundaries as a way of ensuring that love was strong enough to withstand challenges, and she acknowledged Peter's right to feel angry and confused about the changes in his family. "You know," Catherine said, as they rolled out cookie dough together, "I think you're worried that if you start to like me, it might mean you're forgetting your mama. But love doesn't work that way, Peter. Your heart is big enough to hold love for your mama and still have room for other people too." Peter's response was characteristically direct. "But what if you leave like the other ladies did? What if I like you and then you decide we're too much trouble?" The question cut straight to the heart of the child's fears and provided Catherine with an opportunity to address the abandonment issues that had been affecting all the children. "Peter, I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen in the future, because nobody can make that kind of promise, but I can promise that I'm not going to leave because you're too much trouble. In fact, I think you're exactly the right amount of trouble for a boy your age." The conversation that followed was one of the most important Catherine had with any of the children, because it allowed her to address directly the fears and insecurities that had been underlying much of the family's dysfunction. Peter's willingness to express his concerns openly created an opportunity for honest discussion about loss, change, and the possibility of building new relationships without betraying old loyalties. Emma's easy acceptance of Catherine's presence continued to serve as a bridge between the new arrival and the older children. The toddler's natural affection and lack of complicated emotional baggage made her interactions with Catherine uncomplicated and joyful. Watching their baby sister reach eagerly for Mama Kate's arms and settle contentedly against her shoulder helped the older children begin to imagine what a healthy, nurturing relationship with a stepmother might look like. Catherine's bond with Emma developed naturally and without the careful negotiations required with the older children. The toddler needed basic care, consistent routines, and abundant affection, all things that Catherine was well equipped to provide. Emma's rapid language development under Catherine's patient tutelage demonstrated the positive impact that additional adult attention could have on the entire family's dynamics. James observed these gradual changes in his children with a mixture of relief and growing admiration for the woman who had agreed to take on his complicated household. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather a slow, steady improvement. In the family's overall functioning and emotional health, Sarah began smiling more frequently, Daniel's shoulders lost some of their rigid tension, Mary started sharing her artwork voluntarily, Peter's outbursts became less frequent and less destructive, and Emma continued her normal development with the benefit of consistent maternal attention. The partnership that developed between Catherine and James was built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the children's welfare rather than romantic passion. Both had experienced loss and disappointment that made them cautious about emotional vulnerability, but they found common ground in their determination to create stability and security for the 5 young lives that depended on them. Their conversations, conducted primarily in the quiet hours after the children's bedtime, revealed shared values and complementary strengths that suggested the possibility of a successful marriage based on friendship and mutual support. James's business acumen and community connections balanced Catherine's domestic skills and intuitive understanding of child development. His gentleness and patience complemented her practical determination and organizational abilities. The romantic feelings that gradually began to develop between them grew slowly and naturally from their daily collaboration and shared experiences. Catherine found herself appreciating James's dedication to his children and his willingness to accept help without feeling diminished. James was drawn to Catherine's combination of strength and compassion, her ability to see solutions where others saw only problems, and her genuine affection for his children. The first test of their developing relationship came when Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, Millbrook's self-appointed guardian of community morality, decided to pay an unexpected visit to investigate the irregular situation at the Sullivan household. Mrs. Whitman arrived on a crisp October morning with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, ostensibly to welcome Catherine to the community, but actually to assess whether the arrangement met her strict standards of propriety. Catherine received her visitor in the parlor with the same gracious composure she had once employed when dealing with demanding customers. She served tea in the good china, arranged flowers from the garden in a crystal vase, and ensured that the children were properly dressed and on their best behavior. The house itself had been transformed under her care, with polished surfaces, fresh curtains, and the kind of orderly comfort that spoke of efficient management and genuine pride. In one's home, Mrs. Whitman's inspection was thorough and critical. She examined the children's clothing for signs of neglect, questioned them about their religious instruction and academic progress, and scrutinized every aspect of the household's organization for evidence of impropriety or inadequate supervision. Her questions were carefully phrased to elicit information about the family's routines, financial circumstances, and the exact nature of Catherine and James's relationship. "Mr. Sullivan," Mrs. Whitman announced after completing her examination, "there has been considerable discussion in town about your domestic arrangements. A woman living in a household with children under such informal circumstances raises questions about moral propriety and appropriate supervision." James's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "Mrs. Whitman, Catherine and I are legally married. I fail to see how our arrangements could be considered inappropriate by any reasonable standard." "A hastily arranged marriage to a stranger," Mrs. Whitman replied with false sympathy. "Many people wonder whether such an arrangement truly serves the children's best interests. These are impressionable young minds, and they require proper guidance and moral example." The implication that Catherine's presence was somehow harmful to the children struck at the heart of her deepest fears and insecurities. Despite the progress they had made as a family, she still worried about her ability to adequately fill the role that circumstances had thrust upon her. Mrs. Whitman's words echoed the internal doubts that Catherine had been struggling to overcome. Sarah, who had been listening from the kitchen, appeared in the parlor doorway with the kind of controlled fury that Catherine had learned to recognize as the girl's most dangerous mood. "Mrs. Whitman, I believe you're mistaken about our family's circumstances. Mrs. Catherine has been nothing but kind and helpful to all of us. We're better cared for now than we've been since Mama died." The teenager's defense of Catherine was both touching and significant, representing a level of acceptance and trust that had been hard-won over the previous weeks. Mrs. Whitman's disapproving sniff suggested that she viewed Sarah's outspokenness as additional evidence of inadequate discipline and control. "Children often fail to recognize what is truly best for them," Mrs. Whitman observed primly. "Sometimes adult intervention is necessary to protect their welfare, regardless of their own preferences." The veiled threat in her words was unmistakable, and Catherine felt a chill of genuine fear as she realized that Mrs. Whitman's visit might have consequences far beyond social embarrassment. If the woman's concerns led to official scrutiny from child welfare authorities, the family's fragile stability could be destroyed, and the children might face the separation and institutionalization that had been threatened before Catherine's arrival. That evening, after Mrs. Whitman's departure, Catherine found herself alone in the kitchen, struggling with doubts and fears that threatened to overwhelm her newfound confidence. The visit had reminded her of how precarious their situation truly was, and how much the children's welfare depended on her ability to successfully navigate the complex social expectations of a community that viewed their family with suspicion and skepticism. James found her there, staring out the window at the darkening sky, with tears threatening to spill from her determined eyes. "Catherine, please don't let that woman's narrow-mindedness discourage you. She has no authority to interfere with our family, and her opinions carry no weight with any reasonable person." "But what if she's right?" Catherine whispered, voicing the fears that had been plaguing her since Mrs. Whitman's departure. "What if I'm not enough? What if these children deserve better than a mail-order bride who stumbled into their lives without any real understanding of what motherhood requires? What if my presence here is somehow harmful to their development and future prospects?" The vulnerability in Catherine's voice revealed the depths of her insecurities and the weight of responsibility she felt for the children's welfare. James moved to stand beside her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring in the gathering. Darkness. "Catherine, in the weeks since your arrival, I've watched my children transform from wounded survivors into thriving young people with hope for the future. Sarah is laughing again. Daniel is acting like a boy instead of a tired old man. Mary is sharing her gifts with confidence. Peter is learning to trust. And Emma is developing beautifully under your care. If that's not enough, then I don't know what else any mother could provide." The weeks following Mrs. Whitman's visit brought an uneasy tension to the Sullivan household that seemed to seep into every corner of their daily routines. Catherine found herself second-guessing decisions she would have made instinctively before, wondering if every choice would be scrutinized and judged by hostile eyes. The children, sensitive to the adults' anxiety, began walking more carefully through their own lives, as if afraid that too much happiness or normalcy might somehow invite unwanted attention. James threw himself into his work at the mercantile with increased intensity, staying late to reconcile accounts that could have waited, and taking on additional responsibilities that kept him away from home during the evening hours when the family's warmth and laughter might have restored his confidence. His absence, though born of anxiety rather than neglect, created additional pressure on Catherine as she struggled to maintain the household's equilibrium while battling her own growing fears about their precarious situation. Sarah noticed the change immediately, her protective instincts sharpening to an almost painful awareness of every shift in the family's emotional weather. The girl had worked too hard to build their fragile stability to watch it crumble under the weight of outside judgment, and her response was to tighten her control over every aspect of their domestic arrangements. She began rising even earlier to ensure that breakfast was perfectly prepared, that the younger children's clothing was immaculate, and that no detail of household management could provide ammunition for criticism. Daniel responded to the tension by increasing his own efforts to appear mature and responsible beyond his years. The 13-year-old began volunteering for additional chores and responsibilities, as if proving his capability might somehow shield the family from unwanted interference. His schoolwork became secondary to his determination to demonstrate that the Sullivan household was functioning properly under Catherine's guidance, and his teachers began expressing concern about his declining academic performance and obvious exhaustion. Mary retreated into herself with the self-protective instincts of a sensitive child who had learned to recognize when adult conflicts threatened the security of her world. Her artwork became darker and more introspective, filled with images of storms and shadows rather than the bright, optimistic scenes she had been creating under Catherine's encouragement. She stopped sharing her drawings voluntarily and began hiding them again, as if protecting her inner world from potential judgment and criticism. Peter's behavior became increasingly unpredictable as he struggled to understand why the family's Improved circumstances had suddenly become a source of stress rather than celebration. The 6-year-old alternated between desperate attempts to be perfect and explosive outbursts of frustrated energy, as if testing whether Catherine's patience and affection would survive under pressure. His confusion was heartbreaking to witness, particularly because he lacked the emotional vocabulary to express his fears about losing another maternal figure. Emma, mercifully young enough to remain largely unaware of the adult tensions swirling around her, continued her normal development with the resilience of early childhood. Her innocent joy and affectionate demands for attention provided moments of relief from the household's growing stress, reminding everyone of what they were, fighting to protect and preserve. The crisis deepened when Mrs. Whitman returned 3 weeks later, this time accompanied by Mr. Harrison Clark, the county's child welfare inspector. Clark was a thin, serious man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of bureaucratic authority that could transform individual lives with the stroke of a pen. His presence in the Sullivan parlor represented the materialization of every fear that had been haunting Catherine since her first encounter with Mrs. Whitman's disapproval. "Mr. Sullivan," Clark announced after settling himself in the family's best chair, "I've received reports suggesting that the children in this household may be living in circumstances that do not meet appropriate standards for their care and supervision. Mrs. Whitman has expressed concerns about the suitability of your domestic arrangements, and I'm here to conduct an official evaluation." The formal language of bureaucracy could not disguise the devastating implications of his words. Catherine felt her heart stop as she realized that everything they had built together was about to be examined and potentially destroyed by strangers who had no understanding of the love and dedication that had transformed 5 wounded children into a thriving family. James's face went pale with suppressed fury and fear. "Mr. Clark, I fail to understand the basis for such concerns. My children are well fed, properly clothed, receiving appropriate education, and living in a stable, loving home. What more could any reasonable person require?" Clark consulted a folder of papers with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to reducing human lives to checkboxes and statistics. The concerns center primarily around the unconventional nature of your marriage arrangement and questions about Mrs. Sullivan's qualifications and experience with child rearing. Additionally, there have been reports of inadequate supervision and discipline, particularly regarding the older children's behavior and responsibilities. The unfairness of the accusations took Catherine's breath away. Every criticism seemed designed to attack the very qualities that had made her successful in helping the children heal and grow. Her practical approach to household management was being characterized as neglect. Her encouragement of the children's independence was being labeled as inadequate supervision, and her acceptance into the family was being dismissed as an unqualified stranger's presumption. Sarah appeared in the parlor doorway, with Daniel close behind her, both teenagers drawn by the gravity of the adult conversation and its potential implications for their family's future. Catherine could see the fear in their eyes as they recognized the threat that these official visitors represented to everything they valued and cherished. "Sir," Sarah said, with carefully controlled politeness, "may I ask what specific concerns have been raised about our family? We've been happy and well cared for since Mrs. Catherine joined our household, and I believe any honest investigation would confirm that fact." Clark's disapproving frown suggested that he viewed Sarah's willingness to speak for herself as evidence of the inadequate supervision that had been reported. "Young lady, children should not be required to advocate for their own living situations. The fact that you feel compelled to do so raises additional questions about the appropriateness of your current circumstances." The circular logic of his criticism was maddening in its unfairness. Sarah's maturity and articulation, qualities that should have demonstrated the positive impact of Catherine's presence were being twisted into evidence of neglect and inappropriate responsibility. Catherine realized with growing horror that these officials had already decided on their conclusions and were simply looking for evidence to support their predetermined judgment. "Mr. Clark," Catherine said, finding her voice despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her, "might I ask what specific standards you'll be using to evaluate our family's circumstances? I want to ensure that we address any legitimate concerns you might have." The inspector's response was both thorough and devastating. He explained that the evaluation would examine the children's physical health, educational progress, emotional development, and living conditions. He would interview each child separately to assess their feelings about their current situation and their relationships with both parents. He would review the family's financial circumstances, examine the adequacy of their housing and nutrition, and evaluate the appropriateness of the children's responsibilities and supervision. Most ominously, he indicated that if the evaluation revealed any deficiencies in the children's care, he was prepared to recommend their removal to more suitable placements. The older children might be allowed to remain together in an institutional setting, but the younger ones would likely be placed separately with families deemed more appropriate for their needs. The threat of separation struck at the heart of everything the Sullivan family had endured and overcome. These children had already lost their mother and had spent 3 years struggling to maintain their connections to each other and their father. The possibility that bureaucratic judgment might destroy the bonds they had fought so hard to preserve was almost too devastating to contemplate. That evening, after Clark and Mrs. Whitman had departed with promises to return the following week for individual interviews, the family gathered in the kitchen with the subdued atmosphere of people facing an approaching storm. James sat at the head of the table with his head in his hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the threat to his children's welfare. Sarah moved through the familiar motions of preparing dinner with mechanical precision, her face set in lines of grim determination. The younger children seemed to absorb the adults' anxiety through some mysterious osmosis, becoming unusually quiet and clingy. Catherine felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. These children's future depended on her ability to convince skeptical strangers that love and dedication were more important than conventional credentials. She had to find a way to demonstrate that their unconventional family was not only adequate, but actually superior to the institutional alternatives being threatened. "We need to prepare," Catherine said quietly, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over the kitchen. "If Mr. Clark is determined to find fault with our family, we need to ensure that there's nothing for him to criticize. That means making certain that every aspect of our household exceeds whatever standards he might apply." The campaign that followed was both exhausting and heartbreaking in its intensity. Catherine and Sarah worked together to create detailed schedules and routines that would demonstrate the family's organization and stability. They prepared documentation of the children's academic progress, medical care, and extracurricular activities. They organized the house with military precision, ensuring that every room would pass the most rigorous inspection. More painfully, they began coaching the children on how to respond to Clark's questions in ways that would emphasize the positive aspects of their family life, while avoiding any statements that might be misinterpreted as criticism or complaint. The process felt like teaching them to defend their own happiness, and Catherine hated the necessity of it, even as she recognized its importance. Daniel threw himself into the preparations with the desperate energy of someone fighting for his family's survival. He organized his schoolwork to demonstrate his academic achievements, prepared detailed explanations of his household responsibilities to show their appropriateness for his age, and practiced answering potential questions about his satisfaction with their living arrangements. His determination was admirable, but Catherine worried about the pressure he was placing on himself to be perfect. Mary responded to the crisis by creating a series of drawings that depicted their family life in idealized terms. Scenes of domestic harmony, educational activities, and wholesome recreation that might help convince skeptical adults of their household's stability and happiness. The artistic project gave her a sense of contributing to the family's defense, while also providing an outlet for her own anxieties about the uncertain future. Peter struggled to understand why their happiness had suddenly become something that needed to be defended and justified to strangers. His confusion manifested in increased clinginess to Catherine and episodes of anxiety that broke her heart. The 6-year-old seemed to sense that the adults were preparing for some kind of battle, and his protective instincts led him to become fiercely possessive of the family relationships he had learned to trust. Emma's innocent presence became both a comfort and an additional source of worry. The toddler's obvious affection for Catherine and her secure attachment to all her siblings provided powerful evidence of the family's emotional health. But her youth also made her vulnerable to the kind of placement decisions that could separate her permanently from everything familiar and beloved. James struggled with feelings of helplessness and guilt that threatened to overwhelm his natural determination to protect his children. The realization that his decision to seek a mail-order bride had inadvertently exposed his family to this level of scrutiny and potential destruction was almost too painful to bear. He began working even longer hours at the store, partly to demonstrate his financial stability and partly to escape the oppressive atmosphere of preparation and anxiety that had settled over their home. The community's response to news of the impending investigation was mixed and often disappointing. Some neighbors expressed support for the Sullivan family and their satisfaction with Catherine's positive influence on the children's welfare. Others, influenced by Mrs. Whitman's campaign of whispered criticisms and social pressure, remained carefully neutral or even subtly hostile to the family's defense. Mrs. Patterson from the general store proved to be an unexpected ally, offering to provide testimony about the improvements she had observed in the children's appearance and behavior since Catherine's arrival. Several of the children's teachers also expressed willingness to speak positively about their academic progress and emotional development. These offers of support provided some comfort, but Catherine remained acutely aware that bureaucratic decisions were often made based on technical compliance with regulations rather than evidence of actual welfare and happiness. The pressure of the approaching evaluation began to take its toll on every member of the family. Sarah's careful control started showing cracks as she struggled to maintain impossible standards of perfection while supporting her younger siblings through their own anxieties. Daniel's academic performance continued to decline as he devoted increasing amounts of time and energy to household preparations. Mary became increasingly withdrawn and anxious, her artistic expression reflecting the family's collective stress. Peter's behavior became more erratic as he sensed the adult's fear without understanding its source. Catherine found herself caught between her determination to protect the children and her growing fear that her presence in their lives had actually made them more vulnerable to outside interference. The guilt of potentially having caused more harm than good threatened to paralyze her, but the children's obvious dependence on her support forced her to continue fighting for their family's survival. The week before Clark's return brought a series of sleepless nights and increasingly desperate preparations. Catherine and James spent hours rehearsing responses to potential questions and criticisms, trying to anticipate every possible angle of attack while maintaining some semblance of normal family life for the children's sake. The effort was exhausting and emotionally draining, but neither adult could afford to show weakness when so much depended on their ability to present a united and confident front. The children's resilience during this period was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Despite their fear and confusion, they continued to demonstrate the love and loyalty that had bound them together through previous crises. Their determination to defend their family and their faith in Catherine's ability to protect them provided motivation for the enormous effort required to prepare for the evaluation. As the date of Clark's return approached, Catherine realized that the battle they were preparing to fight was about more than just keeping one family together. It was about defending the right of unconventional families to exist and thrive, the value of love over credentials, and the importance of judging success by results rather than methods. The stakes were enormous, and failure would mean not only the destruction of everything they had built together, but also the validation of narrow-minded prejudices that could harm other families facing similar circumstances. The night before the evaluation, Catherine stood alone in the kitchen where she had first connected with Sarah over bread making, where she had comforted Peter through his fears, where she had celebrated Mary's artistic achievements and Daniel's growing confidence. The room held memories of every small victory and moment of connection that had transformed 5 strangers into a family. Tomorrow would determine whether those bonds were strong enough to survive official scrutiny and whether love would prove more powerful than bureaucratic skepticism. Catherine sent up a silent prayer for wisdom, strength, and the ability to protect the children who had become more precious to her than her own life. Whatever happened, she was determined to fight for their right to remain together and to continue growing into the remarkable young people they were destined to become. The morning of the evaluation dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows as Catherine prepared breakfast with hands that trembled only slightly despite the enormity of what lay ahead. She had risen before dawn to ensure that everything would be perfect when Mr. Clark arrived. But more importantly, she wanted these precious moments of normalcy with the children before their world was potentially turned upside down. Sarah moved through her morning routine with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle, her movements efficient and controlled despite the anxiety that radiated from her rigid posture. She had braided her hair with particular care and chosen her best dress, understanding instinctively that appearances would matter enormously in the coming hours. The breakfast she helped prepare was more elaborate than usual, designed to demonstrate the family's proper nutrition and domestic organization, rather than simply to satisfy hunger. Daniel appeared in the kitchen, wearing his Sunday clothes on a Wednesday morning, his face grave with the weight of responsibility he felt for representing the family favorably during his individual interview. The 13-year-old had spent the previous evening organizing his schoolwork and rehearsing answers to potential questions, determined to prove that his household responsibilities had enhanced rather than hindered his development and education. Mary clutched a carefully prepared portfolio of her artwork, selected to showcase both her talents and the family's supportive environment for her creative development. The 10-year-old had included drawings of family activities, holiday celebrations, and daily life scenes that portrayed their household in the most positive possible light. Her nervousness was evident in the way she kept adjusting and readjusting the ribbon that held her portfolio together. Peter seemed to sense the gravity of the situation despite his young age, his usual exuberant energy subdued by the adults' visible tension. The 6-year-old stayed close to Catherine's side, occasionally reaching for her hand or leaning against her skirts as if seeking reassurance that the stability he had learned to trust would survive whatever challenges the day might bring. Emma toddled through the kitchen with her customary cheerfulness, blissfully unaware that her future hung in the balance of official decisions made by strangers. Her innocent babbling and demands for attention provided moments of relief from the oppressive atmosphere, reminding everyone of the pure joy and love that had flourished in their household, despite its unconventional origins. James paced between the kitchen and the front parlor, checking and rechecking arrangements, while struggling to maintain an appearance of calm confidence. His business suit was pressed to perfection, his account books were organized for potential inspection, and every aspect of his household management was documented and ready for scrutiny. The strain of the situation showed in the lines around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders, but his determination to protect his children remained unshakable. When Mr. Clark's carriage pulled up to the front gate precisely at 9 o'clock, Catherine felt her heart begin racing, despite all her mental preparation. Through the window, she could see the inspector stepping down with his leather satchel and folder of papers, his expression as serious and unreadable as it had been during his previous visit. Mrs. Whitman emerged from the carriage behind him, her satisfied smile suggesting that she expected the day's proceedings to validate her concerns about the Sullivan family's arrangements. Catherine gathered the children in the front parlor, taking a moment to look at each precious face and remind herself of exactly what she was fighting to protect. These were not just abstract cases for bureaucratic evaluation. They were Sarah, with her fierce loyalty and premature wisdom, Daniel with his quiet strength and determination to help his family, Mary with her gentle spirit and artistic gifts, Peter with his vulnerable heart hidden behind stubborn defiance, and Emma with her trusting affection and innocent joy. "Remember," Catherine said quietly, "just tell the truth about our family. Don't try to make anything sound better or worse than it is. The truth is that we love each other, we take care of each other, and we're happy together. That's all any family really needs." The formal interviews began immediately after Clark's arrival, conducted in the front parlor with meticulous attention to bureaucratic protocol. James was questioned first about his financial circumstances, his business, operations, his reasons for seeking a mail-order bride, and his assessment of Catherine's impact on the children's welfare. His responses were measured and factual, supported by documentation that demonstrated his ability to provide adequate material support for his family. Catherine's interview followed, focusing intensively on her background, her experience with children, her domestic skills, and her understanding of child development and education. Clark's questions were designed to expose any deficiencies in her qualifications or approach to child rearing, and Catherine could feel him probing for evidence of the inadequacy that Mrs. Whitman had suggested. "Mrs. Sullivan," Clark said, consulting his notes with bureaucratic precision, "you had no previous experience with children before joining this household. How do you justify taking responsibility for 5 young lives without proper training or credentials?" The question struck at Catherine's deepest insecurities, but she had prepared for this line of attack. "Mr. Clark, I believe that love, patience, and dedication are the most important qualifications for caring for children. While I may not have formal training, I've devoted myself completely to learning each child's individual needs and supporting their development in every way possible. The results speak for themselves in their health, happiness, and progress." Clark's skeptical expression suggested that he found her answer inadequate, but Catherine continued with growing confidence. "Moreover, I haven't been working alone. The children already had a foundation of love and values from their parents, and I've simply tried to build upon that foundation while respecting their individual personalities and needs." The individual interviews with the children proved to be the most crucial part of the evaluation process. Sarah went first, facing Clark's questions with the composure of someone far older than her 15 years. When asked about her satisfaction with the family's current arrangements, she spoke eloquently about the improvements in their daily life since Catherine's arrival. Before Mrs. Catherine came, Sarah explained, I was trying to be mother to 4 children while still being a child myself. I was exhausted and overwhelmed, and I know I wasn't giving my brothers and sisters everything they needed. Now I can focus on my own education and development while still helping with family responsibilities. Mrs. Catherine has made it possible for all of us to be children again. Clark's questioning became more aggressive as he pressed Sarah about her household, responsibilities, and the appropriateness of her role in family management. Don't you think it's unusual for a 15-year-old girl to have so much responsibility for her siblings' care? Sarah's response was both mature and pointed. Sir, it was unusual and unfair when I was trying to manage everything alone. Now that we have proper adult supervision and support, my responsibilities are appropriate for my age and abilities. Mrs. Catherine has taught me valuable skills while ensuring that I'm not overwhelmed by duties that should belong to adults. Daniel's interview revealed the positive impact that Catherine's presence had made on his academic and personal development. When questioned about his satisfaction with the family's arrangements, he spoke honestly about the relief of sharing responsibilities that had been too heavy for his young shoulders. I was failing in school because I was spending all my time worrying about the farm and the household, Daniel admitted. Mrs. Catherine helped me organize my responsibilities so that I could focus on my education while still contributing to the family. My grades have improved significantly, and I'm not constantly worried about everything falling apart if I make a mistake. Clark pressed him about whether he felt his childhood had been compromised by excessive responsibilities. Daniel's thoughtful response demonstrated the maturity and wisdom that Catherine's guidance had helped develop. I think learning to contribute to my family's welfare has been valuable for my development, Daniel said carefully. But Mrs. Catherine has made sure that my responsibilities are appropriate and that I have time for school, friends, and activities that boys my age should enjoy. I feel more confident and capable now, not less. Mary's quiet voice carried surprising strength when she spoke about her artistic development and the encouragement she had received under Catherine's care. Her portfolio of drawings provided visual evidence of a child who was thriving creatively and emotionally in a supportive environment. Mrs. Catherine is the first adult who really understood my drawings, Mary explained shyly. She helped me see that my art was valuable and gave me materials to develop my skills. She also helped me find my voice in family discussions and encouraged me to express my own opinions instead of always following what others wanted. Peter's interview was perhaps the most revealing, as the 6-year-old's honest responses demonstrated the emotional healing that had taken place under Catherine's patient care. When asked about his feelings toward his stepmother, Peter's answer was characteristically direct. I was really mad when Mama Kate first came because I thought she was trying to replace my real mama, Peter admitted. But then I learned that she wasn't trying to be my real mama. She was trying to be a different kind of mama who could take care of us now, and she's really good at it. She makes the best cookies, and she doesn't get mad when I make mistakes. And she helps me with my letters. Even Emma's limited vocabulary provided evidence of her secure attachment to Catherine and her healthy development in the family environment. When Clark asked the toddler to identify family members, Emma's enthusiastic Mama Kate left no doubt about her feelings toward her stepmother. The final phase of the evaluation involved Clark's inspection of the house, the children's living conditions, their educational materials, and the overall organization of the household. Catherine and Sarah had prepared meticulously for this examination, ensuring that every room would demonstrate proper care and attention to the children's welfare. Clark's methodical inspection revealed a home that exceeded every standard for child welfare. The children's clothing was clean and well maintained. Their bedrooms were comfortable and appropriately furnished. The kitchen and dining areas were spotless and well organized, and educational materials were readily available and obviously well used. More importantly, the house radiated the warmth and love that no amount of official preparation could fabricate. The walls displayed Mary's artwork alongside family photographs. Peter's school papers were proudly posted on the kitchen bulletin board. Emma's toys were scattered in corners where she played under watchful supervision, and books and games suggested a household where learning and recreation were valued equally. Mrs. Whitman's attempts to highlight potential deficiencies were consistently undermined by the overwhelming evidence of proper care and attention. Her complaints about the children's independence and outspokenness were revealed to be criticisms of healthy development rather than legitimate concerns about welfare or supervision. As the day progressed, Clark's official skepticism began to give way to grudging recognition that the Sullivan household represented successful child-rearing rather than the neglect and inadequacy that had been reported. The children's obvious affection for Catherine, their healthy development, their academic progress, and their emotional stability provided irrefutable evidence that their unconventional family was thriving. The turning point came when several community members arrived unexpectedly to speak on the family's behalf. Mrs. Patterson from the general store brought a petition signed by dozens of townspeople attesting to the positive changes they had observed in the Sullivan children since Catherine's arrival. The children's teachers arrived to provide testimony about their improved academic performance and emotional development. Even the local minister came to vouch for the family's moral character and positive influence in the community. Mr. Clark, Mrs. Patterson announced with the authority of someone who had known the Sullivan family for years, "I've watched these children grow up, and I can tell you without hesitation that they've never been better cared for or happier than they are. Now, Mrs. Sullivan has transformed this family in the most positive ways possible." The teacher's testimony was equally compelling. "Sarah has blossomed academically and socially since gaining proper support at home," Miss Anderson reported. "Daniel's grades have improved dramatically, and he's participating in school activities. For the first time in years, Mary is more confident and expressive, and Peter has overcome behavioral problems that were clearly related to emotional stress." Clark found himself facing a mountain of evidence that contradicted every concern that had prompted his investigation. The children were healthy, happy, well-educated, and obviously thriving under Catherine's care. The household was properly managed, financially stable, and supported by a community that recognized and appreciated the positive changes that had taken place. Mrs. Whitman's final attempt to salvage her position involved questioning whether the children's obvious attachment to Catherine might make them reluctant to report any problems or concerns. This desperate criticism was immediately challenged by Sarah's dignified response. "Mrs. Whitman," Sarah said with remarkable composure, "you seem to be suggesting that our happiness and security are somehow suspicious. I can assure you that we're perfectly capable of recognizing good care when we receive it, and we're also capable of speaking honestly about our experiences. The fact is that Mrs. Catherine has given us everything we needed to heal and grow as a family." Clark's final interviews with James and Catherine focused on their long-term plans and their commitment to maintaining the stability and care that had been demonstrated throughout the evaluation. Both adults spoke with conviction about their dedication to the children's welfare and their determination to continue building the strong family foundation they had established. "Mrs. Sullivan," Clark said in his concluding questions, "what would you say to those who question whether a mail-order marriage can provide adequate stability for children who have already experienced significant loss?" Catherine's response came from the depths of her heart and the certainty born of daily experience. "Mr. Clark, I would say that families are built on love, commitment, and shared dedication to each other's welfare, not on the particular circumstances that bring people together. These children needed someone who would love them unconditionally, support their individual development, and help them build on the strong foundation their parents provided. The fact that James and I found each other through correspondence rather than conventional courtship doesn't diminish our commitment to each other or to these precious children. When Clark announced his decision late that afternoon, the relief that swept through the household was almost overwhelming in its intensity. "Based on my thorough evaluation," he declared formally, "I find no evidence of inadequate care or supervision in this household. The children are thriving under current arrangements, and I see no basis for recommending any changes to their living situation." Mrs. Whitman's protests were dismissed with bureaucratic finality. "Madam, my evaluation is based on objective standards of child welfare, not personal opinions about domestic arrangements. This family exceeds every requirement for proper child care and supervision." The celebration that followed Clark's departure was subdued by exhaustion, but profound in its joy and relief. The children gathered around Catherine with hugs and tears, their gratitude and love overflowing after hours of stress and uncertainty. James pulled Catherine close, his own eyes bright with unshed tears, as he realized how close they had come to losing everything they had built together. Sarah's embrace was perhaps the most meaningful, representing not just relief, but the complete acceptance and trust that had been building since Catherine's arrival. "Thank you," the girl whispered, "for fighting for us, for choosing us, for making us a real family again." The weeks that followed brought a sense of peace and security that the family had never quite achieved before facing the threat of separation. The crisis had tested every relationship and revealed the strength of the bonds they had forged together. More importantly, it had demonstrated to the entire community that love and dedication were more important than conventional arrangements when it came to creating successful families. Catherine's role as stepmother was no longer questioned or scrutinized, but simply accepted as a natural part of the Sullivan family's identity. The children continued to thrive under her care, developing into confident, capable young people who carried the lessons of love and resilience they had learned through adversity. Daniel's academic achievement began earning recognition that opened doors to future opportunities he had never imagined possible. Sarah's leadership abilities and mature wisdom made her a respected voice among her peers and adults alike. Mary's artistic talents continued to flourish, supported by a family that recognized and celebrated her gifts. Peter's emotional healing progressed steadily as he learned to trust in the permanence of love and security. Emma grew into a bright, confident toddler whose easy affection and joyful spirit reflected the stability and love that surrounded her. James and Catherine's marriage deepened from practical partnership into genuine love and mutual respect. Their shared experience of fighting for their family's survival had revealed the strength of their commitment to each other and to the children who had brought them together. They discovered that the best marriages were built not on passion alone, but on shared values, common goals, and the daily choice to support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. The Sullivan household became a beacon of hope for other unconventional families in their community, demonstrating that love could triumph over prejudice and that determined people could create strong families regardless of their starting circumstances. Catherine began quietly helping other women who found themselves in difficult situations, sharing the wisdom she had gained and offering support to those who needed encouragement to believe in their own strength and capabilities. Years later, as Catherine watched Sarah graduate as valedictorian of her class, Daniel receive a scholarship to study agriculture, Mary win recognition for her artwork, Peter excel in his studies, and Emma take her first steps toward her own bright future. She reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. The mail-order bride arrangement that had seemed like desperate necessity had become the foundation for a love story that encompassed not just two adults, but an entire family. The house that had once echoed with grief and uncertainty now rang with laughter, discussion, and the comfortable sounds of a family that knew itself to be loved and secure. The children who had once feared abandonment and loss had grown into young people who understood that families could be built in many different ways, but that love was always the most important ingredient. Catherine's transformation from desperate seamstress to beloved mother and wife proved that second chances were possible for those brave enough to reach for them. Her willingness to fight for children who weren't born to her demonstrated that the bonds of choice could be as strong as those of blood, and that protection and love came from the heart rather than from legal documents or social conventions. The story of the Sullivan family became part of Millbrook's local history, told and retold as an example of how ordinary people could create extraordinary love through dedication, courage, and faith in each other. Their legacy lived on in the children they raised, the community they served, and the countless other families who found hope in their example. Sometimes, the most beautiful families are born not from perfect circumstances, but from the determination to create something wonderful from whatever materials life provides. Sometimes, a mail-order bride becomes exactly what she never knew she was searching for. Not just a wife, but a mother, a protector, and a woman whose love could shelter precious souls and help them flourish. And sometimes, in protecting others, we discover that we've been protecting the very best parts of ourselves all along. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Millbrook in a pristine covering of snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Catherine stood at the kitchen window watching the flakes fall in lazy spirals past the glass, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee as she observed her children playing in the yard below. The word came naturally now, without hesitation or qualification. Her children, the 5 souls who had claimed her heart so completely that she could no longer imagine life without them. Sarah moved through the snow with 18-year-old Grace, helping Emma build a snowman while simultaneously supervising Peter's enthusiastic but chaotic snow fort construction. The young woman had blossomed into someone Catherine barely recognized, from the exhausted, overwhelmed girl who had greeted her at the train station 3 years earlier. Sarah's acceptance to the state teaching college had arrived just last week, and her joy at the prospect of continuing her education was matched only by her confidence that the family would thrive in her absence. Daniel, now 16 and nearly as tall as his father, worked alongside James to clear the paths around the house and barn. The boy's transformation had been remarkable to witness. Where once there had been a child burdened by premature responsibility, now there was a young man who contributed to the family's welfare from choice rather than desperate necessity. His academic achievements had already attracted attention from several agricultural colleges, and his future seemed bright with possibilities that had once seemed impossible. Mary, at 13, had developed into a thoughtful young woman whose artistic talents were beginning to gain recognition beyond their small community. Her latest painting hung in the front parlor, a luminous portrait of their family gathered around the kitchen table that captured not just their physical appearances, but somehow also the love and contentment that filled their daily lives. The local newspaper had recently featured one of her drawings, and talk had begun about arranging formal art instruction that could nurture her exceptional gifts. Peter, now 9 years old, had grown into a confident, curious boy whose mischievous energy was channeled into constructive pursuits rather than the defensive rebellion that had once characterized his behavior. His reading had progressed remarkably under Catherine's patient tutoring, and his natural leadership abilities were beginning to emerge as he took pride in helping his little sister navigate the complexities of growing up. Emma, at 5, was a bright spark of joy who moved through the world with the secure confidence of a child who had never doubted her place in her family's affections. Her vocabulary had expanded dramatically, her imagination was boundless, and her easy affection for everyone in the household served as a daily reminder of the healing power of unconditional love. She had no memory of the uncertainty and fear that had once shadowed their home, knowing only the stability and warmth that Catherine's presence had brought to their lives. The transformation of the Sullivan household extended far beyond the children's individual development. The house itself had evolved into something that reflected the personalities and interests of all its inhabitants, while maintaining the sense of order and comfort that Catherine had worked so hard to establish. Mary's artwork adorned the walls, alongside family photographs that documented their journey from tentative strangers to confident family members. Sarah's books and college preparation materials occupied a place of honor in the front parlor. Daniel's agricultural journals and farming manuals shared shelf space with Peter's adventure stories and Emma's picture books. The kitchen had become the undisputed heart of their home, where homework was completed, family decisions were discussed, and the day's events were shared over meals that had evolved from simple sustenance into celebrations of their togetherness. Catherine's recipe collection had grown to include dishes that honored Margaret Sullivan's memory, while incorporating new traditions that reflected their family's unique character and preferences. James had flourished in ways that went far beyond the obvious relief of sharing domestic responsibilities. The man who had once seemed overwhelmed by the challenge of raising 5 children alone had discovered reserves of patience, wisdom, and joy that surprised even him. His business had prospered under the stability that Catherine's presence had brought to his personal life, and his standing in the community had been enhanced by the obvious success of his household management and child-rearing. The romance that had developed between Catherine and James had deepened gradually from mutual respect and shared goals into something profound and enduring. Their love was built on the solid foundation of daily partnership, common values, and the shared experience of nurturing 5 remarkable young people through the challenges of growing up. They had learned to communicate with the easy intimacy of people who trusted each other completely, and their relationship provided a model of healthy marriage for the children to observe and emulate. The community's acceptance of the Sullivan family's unconventional origins had evolved into something approaching celebration of their success. Catherine had become a respected figure in Millbrook society, sought out for advice by other mothers, and valued for her practical wisdom and generous spirit. Her involvement in church activities, school functions, and community service had demonstrated that mail-order arrangements could produce citizens who contributed meaningfully to local welfare and progress. Mrs. Whitman's influence had waned significantly in the years following the failed child welfare investigation. Her attempts to maintain her position as arbiter of community morality had been undermined by the obvious success of the very family she had tried to destroy. Public opinion had shifted decisively in favor of judging families by their results rather than their origins, and Mrs. Whitman found herself increasingly isolated in her narrow-minded prejudices. The broader implications of the Sullivan family's success had rippled through the community in ways that Catherine was only beginning to understand. Other unconventional families had found courage in their example, and several successful matches had been made through matrimonial agencies as people recognized that love and compatibility could develop in many different ways. The rigid social expectations that had once governed family formation were slowly giving way to more flexible approaches that prioritized happiness and stability over conventional arrangements. Catherine's correspondence with other mail order brides had grown into an informal network of women who supported each other through the challenges of building families with strangers who became beloved partners. Her letters were filled with practical advice about household management, child rearing, and the delicate process of winning the trust and affection of children who had experienced loss and disappointment. The wisdom she had gained through her own struggles was freely shared with others facing similar challenges. The success of her marriage and motherhood had also attracted attention from women's advocacy groups who recognized the importance of creating economic opportunities that allowed women to choose their own destinies rather than being forced into desperate circumstances. Catherine had begun speaking quietly about the need for better education and employment options for women, using her own experience to illustrate how much talent and capability were wasted when society failed to provide adequate opportunities for female contribution and leadership. Sarah's upcoming departure for college represented both a triumph and a transition that would test the family's strength in new ways. The young woman's academic achievements and leadership abilities had earned her a full scholarship to pursue teacher training, fulfilling a dream that had seemed impossible during the dark years following her mother's death. Her confidence in the family's ability to thrive in her absence demonstrated the security and stability that Catherine's presence had created. The preparations for Sarah's departure had become a family project that involved everyone in planning for the changes that her absence would bring. Daniel would assume some additional responsibilities around the house. Mary would take on a greater role in helping with Emma's care, and Peter would step up to assist with various household tasks. Most importantly, Catherine would have the opportunity to demonstrate that her role as family anchor was secure enough to weather the normal transitions that came with children growing up and pursuing their own paths. The Christmas season brought special significance to their household that year, as it would be Sarah's last before beginning her college journey. Catherine had spent weeks preparing special gifts and treats that would create lasting memories for all the children. The traditions they had established over the previous 3 years had grown into beloved customs that reflected their family's unique character, while honoring the heritage that Margaret Sullivan had left for her children. The Christmas Eve celebration began with the family attending church services together, where their presence as a united and happy family served as a testament to the power of love to overcome adversity. Catherine felt a profound sense of gratitude as she sat between James and Emma, watching Sarah, Daniel, Mary, and Peter participate in the familiar rituals with obvious contentment and belonging. The evening continued with the exchange of gifts that Catherine had carefully chosen to reflect each child's individual interests and dreams. Sarah received books that would support her college studies, along with a beautiful writing set that acknowledged her growing skill as a correspondent and future teacher. Daniel's gifts included advanced agricultural texts and tools that would help him pursue his interest in innovative farming techniques. Mary received art supplies and an easel that would support her continued artistic development. Peter's presents included adventure books and educational games that would challenge his bright mind while entertaining his active imagination. Emma's gifts were carefully selected toys that would support her development while providing the simple joy that made childhood magical. The evening's most meaningful moment came when Catherine presented each child with a handwritten letter that expressed her love and pride in their individual accomplishments and character. These letters had taken weeks to compose, as Catherine struggled to find words adequate to convey the depth of her feelings for each precious soul who had transformed her life in ways she was still discovering. Sarah's letter acknowledged her remarkable strength and maturity, while encouraging her to embrace the opportunities that lay ahead, with confidence in her family's unwavering support. Daniel's letter celebrated his growth from an overwhelmed boy into a responsible young man, while expressing pride in his academic achievements and future prospects. Mary's letter recognized her artistic gifts and gentle spirit, while encouraging her to continue developing the confidence to share her talents with the world. Peter's letter celebrated his transformation from an angry, frightened child into a bright, loving boy, while acknowledging the courage it had taken to open his heart to trust again. Emma's letter, though necessarily simple given her age, expressed the joy and love that her presence brought to everyone around her. The children's responses to these letters created a moment of emotional intimacy that Catherine would treasure for the rest of her life. The tears, hugs, and expressions of love that followed demonstrated the depth of the bonds they had forged together and the security that allowed them to express their feelings freely and honestly. The new year brought fresh challenges and opportunities that would test the family's resilience while providing new avenues for growth and development. Sarah's departure for college in the spring would mark the beginning of a new phase in their family's evolution, one that would require all of them to adapt to changing roles and responsibilities, while maintaining the love and support that had sustained them through previous transitions. Catherine's own growth during the years since her arrival in Millbrook had been as remarkable as the changes in the children she had come to love. The desperate, uncertain woman who had stepped off the train with only her practical skills and determined spirit had evolved into a confident mother, capable wife, and respected community member whose influence extended far beyond her own household. Her correspondence with women facing similar challenges had grown into an informal counseling ministry that provided support and encouragement to those struggling with difficult circumstances. The wisdom she had gained through her own experience was freely shared with others who needed hope and practical guidance for building better lives. Her reputation for sound advice and genuine compassion had spread throughout the region, bringing visitors who sought her counsel on matters ranging from domestic management to child-rearing to marriage relationships. The success of her own unconventional family had also made Catherine an advocate for more flexible approaches to social welfare and family support. Her experience with the child welfare investigation had taught her the importance of defending families who found strength and love in non-traditional arrangements. She had begun working quietly with other community leaders to develop more nuanced approaches to evaluating family welfare that focused on results rather than conformity to conventional expectations. The spring of Sarah's departure arrived with a mixture of excitement and poignancy that touched every member of the family. The young woman's preparations for college had become a celebration of achievement that honored both her individual accomplishments and the family support that had made them possible. Her confidence in her ability to succeed in her studies was matched by her security in knowing that her family's love would remain constant, regardless of physical distance. The day of Sarah's departure dawned bright and clear, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed to encourage new beginnings and fresh adventures. The entire family gathered on the front porch to see her off, their emotions ranging from pride to excitement to the natural sadness that accompanies any significant transition. Catherine's final conversation with Sarah before her departure encapsulated everything she had learned about motherhood, love, and the courage required to let go when holding on would limit someone's growth. "Remember," Catherine said as she embraced the young woman who had become like her own daughter, "you carry our love with you wherever you go, and you'll always have a home here when you need it. But don't be afraid to build new relationships and explore new possibilities. The strength you've developed will serve you well in whatever challenges you face." Sarah's response reflected the maturity and wisdom that Catherine's guidance had helped develop. "I know I can succeed because you taught me that love doesn't limit, it empowers. You showed me that families can grow and change without losing what makes them special. I'll carry those lessons with me and hopefully pass them on to the children I'll teach." The months following Sarah's departure brought new rhythms and responsibilities that demonstrated the family's adaptability and continued strength. Daniel stepped naturally into greater leadership among the remaining siblings, while continuing to excel in his own academic and agricultural pursuits. Mary's artistic talents continued to flourish under Catherine's encouragement, and her growing confidence was evident in her willingness to share her work more broadly. Peter's development into a thoughtful, responsible boy continued steadily, his natural leadership abilities emerging as he helped guide Emma through the transitions that came with growing up. Emma herself continued to blossom into a bright, confident child whose security in her family's love provided the foundation for healthy exploration and development. Catherine's role evolved as well, encompassing not just the daily care of the remaining children, but also the broader responsibility of helping them maintain connections with Sarah while building their own individual identities and pursuits. Her correspondence with Sarah became a bridge that kept the young woman connected to family events and decisions, while respecting her growing independence and adult responsibilities. The success of their family's adaptation to Sarah's absence provided additional evidence of the strength and resilience that Catherine's presence had helped create. The bonds they had forged were strong enough to withstand normal life transitions, while flexible enough to accommodate growth and change. The love that had begun as necessity and choice had deepened into something that could weather any challenge while continuing to nurture individual development and family unity. As Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point, she marveled at the unexpected ways that life could unfold when people were willing to take risks for love and hope. The mail-order arrangement that had seemed like a desperate gamble had become the foundation for a love story that encompassed not just two adults, but an entire family. The children who had needed protection and stability had become sources of joy and purpose that enriched every aspect of her existence. The house that had once echoed with uncertainty and loss now rang with laughter, learning, and the comfortable sounds of people who knew themselves to be cherished and secure. The future that had once seemed fraught with obstacles and limitations now sparkled with possibilities for continued growth, achievement, and happiness. The woman who had traveled across the country with nothing but determination and hope had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the courage to say yes to unexpected opportunities. The legacy of their family's success extended far beyond their own happiness to touch the lives of countless others who found hope and inspiration in their example. The mail-order bride who had become a beloved mother and protector had proved that families could be built in many different ways, but that love was always the most important foundation. Her story became part of the larger narrative of women who refused to accept limitations and instead created their own opportunities for meaningful, productive lives. Years later, as Catherine watched her children pursue their own dreams and build their own families, she knew that the greatest gift she had given them was not stability or security, though those had been important. The greatest gift had been the example of how love could transform ordinary people into something extraordinary, how courage could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and how families could be built from choice and commitment rather than mere circumstance. The woman who had once feared that she was too late for love and family had discovered that the best chapters of life often begin when we least expect them, in places we never planned to go, with people we never imagined we would meet. Sometimes the most beautiful families are born not from perfect circumstances, but from the determination to create something wonderful from whatever materials life provides. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.